November 23, 1943. North Atlantic, 400 miles west of Ireland. The sea was black glass under a waning moon, the kind of night U-boat commanders prayed for. The horizon was endless, the stars faint through a gauze of mist. Somewhere below that silence, Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke stood inside the conning tower of U-515, gripping the periscope handles tight enough that the cold metal burned his palms. Depth 30 meters. Course 270, came the report from the helmsman. Henke didn't answer. He was listening. To the ocean itself, the low, pulsing throb of his own diesels mixed with the faint hum of distant propellers. For a man who'd spent most of the war beneath the waves, sound had become a language more truthful than speech. He adjusted the periscope, tracing the faint silhouette of a convoy cutting east through the fog. There, merchantmen, their blacked-out hulls rolling in the swell, the glint of waves against steel. And escort ships too, smaller, faster, darting like sharks at the convoy's edges. He exhaled slowly. There they are. His first officer, Oberleutnant Zur C. Friedrich Eck, leaned closer. "Orders, Herr Kapitän?" Henke lowered the scope. His face, normally sharp and confident, was drawn tonight. He'd hunted convoys since 1941, had sunk over 20 ships, earned the Knight's Cross, been toasted in Berlin as one of the Atlantic's deadliest hunters. But this time, something was different. "This convoy has teeth," he murmured. "Too many escorts. We attack and they'll smell us before we even dive." Still, orders were orders. Admiral Donitz himself had radioed earlier that evening. "Wolfpack Shill, intercept and destroy convoy SL-139. 10 boats, spread in a crescent along the convoy's projected path." The tactic had worked before. A coordinated assault from multiple directions, overwhelming the escorts, smashing the freighters before dawn. Henke looked at his crew. They were ready, pale, unshaven, but steady. Boys, most of them. The war had devoured Germany's best years, leaving the youth to man the steel coffins. "All right," he said finally. "Surface attack. Prepare torpedoes 1 through 4. The crew moved with quiet efficiency. Valves opened. Compressed air hissed. Somewhere aft, the torpedo mechanics whispered to each other, as if afraid the sea might overhear. "Open outer doors," Henke ordered. The U-boat rose slightly as ballast shifted. Through the scope, he caught the distant spark of light on the horizon. A star shell, faint but unmistakable. Then another and another. "Scheisse," he muttered. Within seconds, the night exploded with illumination. White flares hung above the convoy like miniature suns, casting the sea in ghostly daylight. The merchantmen loomed like phantoms, their hull numbers gleaming. The escorts moved fast. Too fast. "Dive! Schnell!" Klaxons wailed. Men scrambled down the ladder. The sea boiled as U-515 plunged beneath the surface, her hull groaning under the sudden pressure. At 60 meters, the world turned to silence. Then sound returned, but sharper now, metallic, deliberate. Ping, ping, ping. Sonar, British sonar. Active, strong, close. Henke clenched his jaw. "They've got radar too. They saw us before we even moved." For the next hour, depth charges rained like thunder. The lights flickered. Dust and rust cascaded from the ceiling. Somewhere aft, a pipe burst, spraying salt water across the machinery. When the barrage finally stopped, Henke whispered to no one in particular, "The ocean isn't ours anymore." The next morning brought no sunrise, only grayness. The sea was a bruised plain, flecked with oil and debris. Henke surfaced U-515 just long enough to recharge batteries and assess the damage. The air that rushed in through the open hatch was sharp and cold, carrying the bitter smell of diesel and fear. "2 of ours are gone," Eck reported quietly, scanning the radio messages. U-536 and U-262. No contact since 0200. Henke nodded, though the words felt like a knife. 2 boats gone in one night. 40 men apiece. 80 souls erased without a trace. The wolfpack had become a ghost pack. He stood on the bridge, binoculars raised, scanning the endless expanse of water. The Atlantic had never looked so empty. Once, it had been their kingdom. A vast hunting ground where Allied convoys were helpless prey. Now, it felt like an open grave. From somewhere astern, the diesel engines throbbed, struggling against the swell. The sea slapped the hull, rhythmically, like a slow, mocking applause. Henke turned to his first officer. "Radio Donitz. Tell him the British have new equipment. They're escorts. They see us before we see them." Eck hesitated. "Sir, the Admiral—" "I know what he'll say," Henke interrupted. "Continue the attack. Use the wolfpack tactic. He'll talk about duty, about honor, about the fatherland. But honor doesn't stop depth charges." He lowered his voice. "They can hear everything now, Eck. Even our heartbeat." By midday, the order came through regardless. "Maintain pursuit. Attack again tonight." Henke read it twice, jaw tightening. Donitz still believed the old methods would work, that the ocean could be conquered by will alone. But the war had changed. He glanced down at the map table inside the control room. Tiny colored pins marked the known positions of the wolfpack. Only half remained. The others had gone silent. He closed his eyes, remembering the early years, 1940, 1941, when every patrol had been a victory. When the U-boats surfaced proudly after sinking ships, crews cheering, flares bursting, messages of triumph sent back to Berlin. They'd been heroes then. The gray wolves. Men of iron in an empire of water. Now they were the hunted. That night, the sea was black again. But Henke felt the enemy everywhere. Invisible eyes watched from the horizon. The U-boat crept forward, periscope just above the surface. "Convoy bearing 150, whispered the sound operator. "Multiple propellers. Fast." Henke nodded. "Steady. Wait for the gap." Through the lens, he saw them. The faint silhouettes of merchant ships, stretched in a long column, perfectly aligned. And weaving between them, like shepherds guarding sheep. The destroyers. He could almost admire their efficiency. Fire one. The first torpedo hissed away, a silver dart disappearing into the deep. Fire two. The second followed. Henke didn't breathe. Moments later, 2 dull thuds shook the night. Columns of fire rose from a freighter's stern, the light flickering across the waves. The crew erupted in cheers. For a heartbeat, it felt like the old days again. Then the sonar operator's face went pale. "Multiple pings, sir. Closing fast. 3 destroyers, no 4. Henke slammed his fist down. "Hard dive! Take her down, now!" The engines roared. The U-boat plunged. Pressure creaked against the hull. The first depth charge went off above them, then another, closer. The shock waves hammered the boat like fists. Lights flickered. A wrench clattered to the deck. The helmsman screamed something lost in the noise. "Level her out. Depth 100 meters. Another explosion, this one close enough to throw Henke against the bulkhead. His ears rang. He could taste metal. When the barrage stopped at last, the silence was worse. "Damage report," he croaked. "Minor flooding in the aft compartment. Stern dive planes jammed." Henke steadied himself, gripping the handrail. The crew looked to him, faces pale and wet with sweat. He forced a grim smile. "We'll fix it. We always do." But deep down, he knew this was no longer a battle. It was an execution delayed by minutes. The Allies had turned the ocean into a machine. A vast, coordinated network of radar, sonar, aircraft, and code breakers. Every time a U-boat surfaced, The sky and sea answered back with precision. And in that moment, Werner Henke understood what donuts never would. Germany was no longer fighting the British Navy. They were fighting mathematics. December 3rd, 1943. The North Atlantic was a graveyard. For 3 days, U-515 had hunted in vain. No torpedoes fired, no contacts made. The sea was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that carried danger in every ripple. Henke's men moved like ghosts through the narrow steel corridors, their faces hollow, eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. They'd surfaced twice to recharge batteries, each time under the watchful eye of radar-equipped liberators that forced them back down within minutes. The ocean had become smaller, suffocating. The surface, once freedom, was now a killing ground. Inside the control room, the air was thick with diesel fumes and sweat. Condensation dripped from the pipes like cold rain. The sound of the hydrophone filled the space. A low hum, distant engines. And, most terrifying of all, the steady ping of sonar, sweeping across the depths like the pulse of an unseen predator. Henke stood by the periscope, pale light flickering across his face. "Any change?" The sound operator shook his head. "They're still there, sir, holding position above us. 2, maybe 3 destroyers." Henke's expression didn't change, but his knuckles whitened on the edge of the chart table. They were trapped, pinned to the seabed like an insect under glass. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of it. Not just the depth pressing against the hull, but the futility pressing against his chest. Oberleutnant Eck approached quietly. "Batteries at 40%, sir. Oxygen is dropping." Henke nodded slowly. "We wait until nightfall, then surface? It's our only chance." He looked around the room. The men avoided his eyes, each lost in his own private war. One sailor clutched a rosary. Another stared at the depth gauge, whispering numbers under his breath as if reciting a prayer. Hours passed. The U-boat creaked and groaned, steel flexing under pressure. Then, somewhere far above, a new sound joined the rhythm. Propellers, fast and deliberate. "Aircraft," the sound operator whispered. "They've called in aircraft." Henke closed his eyes. The Allied hunter-killer groups had perfected this. Destroyers pinned U-boats underwater until aircraft arrived to finish the job. It was mechanical, efficient, almost inhuman. When night finally fell, Henke gave the order. "Surface." The ballast tanks vented with a roar, the hull trembling as the boat rose. The moment the conning tower broke the surface, the world erupted in noise. Searchlights cutting across the Black Sea, engines roaring, and the distinct growl of aircraft diving. "Alarm! Down! Dive!" But it was too late. The ocean lit up as flares burst overhead, turning the night into day. A Liberator swept low, its bomb bay open. Depth charges dropped in perfect sequence. The first explosion hit close enough to lift U-515 out of the water. Men were thrown from their stations. Steam hissed, gauges shattered, lights flickered out. Henke was slammed into the bulkhead, ears ringing, blood running down his temple. "Damage control. Flooding. Forward compartment hit. Pressure hull compromised. Seal it." The next explosion knocked out power completely. The boat tilted, sinking fast. Emergency lights blinked on, casting everything in red. "Blow ballast," Henke shouted. "All tanks." The pumps whined weakly, then died. The boat kept descending. 80 meters, 90, 100. The hull moaned like a dying animal. In the dim red light, Henke met Eck's eyes. Neither spoke, but both knew. This was how most U-boat commanders ended. Not in glory, but in silence, vanishing beneath the waves. Then, miraculously, the descent slowed. The engineers had managed to patch the worst of the flooding. The depth gauge steadied at 110 meters. The crew exhaled as one. "Keep her level," Henke ordered quietly. "No noise, no movement. We wait." They waited for 12 hours. No one slept. Every creak of the hull sounded like death tapping at the door. At dawn, the sonar faded. The destroyers had moved on. Henke leaned back against the bulkhead, staring at the condensation running down the metal like tears. He'd survived another hunt, but it didn't feel like victory. He turned to Ek. "We can't keep doing this." Ek frowned. "Sir?" Henke's voice was low, almost a whisper. "We're not fighting a navy anymore, Ek. We're fighting a machine. The ocean itself is turning against us." He looked up at the ceiling, toward the crushing weight of the sea above. "Donut still thinks the wolfpack will win us the war. But the wolves are dying, one by one." There was a long silence. Then Henke said, almost to himself, "Germany can't win this war. Not out here, not anymore." December 10th, 1943. Bay of Biscay. The sea was deceptively calm that morning. Pale gray skies, light wind, a gentle swell that rocked U-515 as she limped toward Lorient. For once, there were no explosions, no radar pings, no distant thunder of depth charges. Just the rhythmic sigh of waves against steel. Werner Henke stood on the bridge, his oil-stained cap pulled low, scanning the horizon through binoculars. His crew worked in silence below, patching leaks, nursing the battered diesels back to life. The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, stretched endlessly in every direction. They'd made it, barely. Behind them, the war in the Atlantic was dying. And so was the dream that had fueled it. The first years had been intoxicating. The happy time, the British had called it, when German U-boats seemed unstoppable. Convoys burned in the night, and every return to port meant celebration. Music, champagne, medals, women. Henke remembered the faces of those days, young, invincible, filled with the blind certainty that they were rewriting history beneath the waves. But now, in the winter of '43, all that was gone. From his position on the conning tower, Henke could see the scars of defeat on the very surface of the ocean. Oil slicks drifting like bruises, blackened lifeboats half submerged, seagulls circling where men had once screamed for rescue. The Allies owned the sea now. Their aircraft patrolled from Iceland to the Azores, radar probing every dark corner, sonar hunting every whisper. U-515 was no longer a predator. It was prey. "Aircraft sighted bearing 210. The lookout's voice shattered the calm. Henke spun, lifting his binoculars. In the distance, a speck of silver glinted in the sunlight. A B-24 Liberator, flying low and fast, its wings marked with white stars. "Crash dive!" Klaxons wailed. The crew scrambled down the hatch. Henke followed, sealing it behind him. The U-boat groaned as ballast tanks filled, plunging her beneath the waves. The roar of engines faded as the sea swallowed them. In the dim red light of the control room, men wiped sweat from their faces, breath shallow in the stale air. The sonar operator listened, headphones pressed tight. "She's passing overhead," he whispered, dropping depth charges. The detonations came seconds later. Whump! 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 The hull shuddered. Tools clattered, a pipe burst, spraying a fine mist. Someone screamed. "Hold her steady!" Henke barked. For 30 agonizing minutes, they rode out the assault. The boat creaked, the depth gauge trembled, and somewhere in the machinery, a low groan echoed, like the cry of something alive. Then silence. The Liberator moved on. Henke exhaled slowly, hands shaking. He looked at his men, pale, soaked in sweat, eyes wide with the knowledge that survival had become a matter of luck, not skill. When they surfaced again at dusk, the horizon was clear. But the victory felt hollow. Ek approached quietly, offering a tin mug of coffee. "We'll reach Lorient by morning," he said. "We made it home again." Henke took the cup, but didn't drink. "Home," he repeated softly, as if testing the word. He turned to look west, toward the dying sun. "How many boats didn't?" Eck hesitated. "Latest reports say 27 this month. Possibly more. 27 boats, nearly 1,200 men, lost in a single month." Henke nodded, his jaw tightening. "At this rate, there won't be any of us left by spring." That night, as the U-boat crept through the dark waters of the Bay of Biscay, Henke stood alone in the radio room, scanning intercepted Allied transmissions. The English was clipped, professional, cold. Convoy reports, patrol coordinates, kill confirmations. He realized with grim clarity that the Allies now knew everything. Where the convoys sailed, where the wolfpacks lurked, even when reinforcements left the French ports. The Kriegsmarine had once prided itself on discipline, secrecy, and efficiency. But now, the enemy knew their every move, before they made it. "Bletchley," Henke murmured under his breath. "They're reading us like an open book." He didn't know the name of the place yet, Bletchley Park. But he could feel its shadow in every failed patrol, every ambush, every night spent evading sonar that always found them again. The war, he thought, wasn't being lost at sea. It was being lost in code. By dawn, U-515 reached Lorient. The base, once a fortress bustling with submariners, was now half empty, its pens filled with wrecks and wounded boats. Men walked with haunted eyes, shoulders bent beneath the weight of too many funerals. As Henke disembarked, a mechanic saluted half-heartedly. "Welcome back, Herr Kapitän." Henke looked around at the shattered harbor, the smoke rising from bomb craters, the wreck of U-455 still listing in the dock. He returned the salute slowly. "Back," he said, "but not home." He walked toward the officers' quarters, the sea wind carrying the faint smell of oil and defeat. Inside his cabin that night, he poured a measure of brandy and stared at the wall map above his desk. Red pins marked Allied convoys. Blue pins marked U-boats. There were fewer blue pins every week. He traced one with his fingertip. U-96, lost off the Azores. Another, U-413, sunk with all hands. And another, U-211, depth charged near Newfoundland. Each pin was a coffin. He lowered his head into his hands. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed. Another air raid. But Henke didn't move. He was too tired, too aware that no bunker could shield him from the truth. The age of the U-boat was over, and deep down, he knew it. January 12th, 1944. Lorient, France. The sky above the submarine pens glowed red with the reflection of burning fuel. Allied bombers had come again in the night. Wave after wave, each more relentless than the last. The concrete shelters had held, but everything around them was rubble. Twisted cranes, scorched workshops, and the blackened carcasses of trucks that once carried torpedoes to the docks. Inside the reinforced bunker, U-boat crews moved through the haze like ghosts. Some smoked in silence. Others leaned against the cold concrete walls, staring at nothing. Their uniforms were dirty, their faces drawn, their laughter gone. Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke stood by the open hatch of U-515, hands clasped behind his back, watching mechanics scrape burned paint from the hull. He was alive, but something in him had gone hollow. A few years ago, he would have been inspecting torpedo tubes or checking the periscope bearings himself. Now, he barely spoke. Every boat that left Lorient came back broken, if it came back at all. A young ensign approached with a clipboard. "Herr Kapitän," he said, hesitating, "the Admiral requests your presence. Staff briefing at 0900. Henke nodded without looking up. "Tell him I'll attend." The boy saluted and left. Henke turned his gaze toward the sea beyond the pens. Even in the gray morning light, it shimmered with menace. The Atlantic had once been their ally, wide, silent, forgiving. Now it belonged to the enemy. It carried death on radar waves and sonar pings. When he finally entered the command bunker, the air smelled of stale coffee and defeat. Admiral Donitz stood at the map table, surrounded by his senior staff. His uniform was immaculate, his voice sharp, his conviction unbroken. "Gentlemen," he began, pointing to the Atlantic chart pinned to the wall, "the Führer demands we redouble our efforts. New type twin submarines will turn the tide. Faster, deeper, deadlier. We must hold the line until they're ready." Henke studied the map. Red lines stretched across the ocean. Convoy routes thick with Allied coverage. The gaps, once so inviting, were gone. One of the officers spoke up. "Sir, with respect, the losses." Donitz cut him off. "Losses are the cost of perseverance. The Americans are overconfident. They rely on machines. We rely on men." Henke almost laughed, but he didn't. He'd heard this speech before, too many times. When the meeting ended, Donitz stopped him at the door. "Henke, you're one of our best. You'll lead the next patrol. The Atlantic needs its wolves." Henke met his superior's eyes. "Admiral, the Atlantic doesn't need wolves anymore. It needs mercy." The room went still. Donitz's jaw tightened. "You're tired," he said finally. "Rest before departure. I'll expect you ready in 48 hours. Henke saluted mechanically and left. That night, he sat alone in the mess, a single lamp flickering above the table. Around him, the walls were plastered with propaganda. Smiling crews, victorious boats, bold slogans. "The Atlantic is ours. Atlantic is..." He poured himself a glass of schnapps and stared at the posters. The smiling faces felt obscene. Most of those men were dead now. Eck joined him quietly, setting down 2 cups. "You don't look like a man about to set sail." Henke took a slow sip. "Because I'm not." Eck frowned. "You're refusing orders?" "I'm refusing suicide." He gestured toward the door, toward the sea beyond. "They send us out there knowing we won't come back. We're not hunters anymore, Eck. We're bait, meant to keep the enemy busy while the Reich burns behind us." The first officer said nothing. He just stared into his drink. Finally, he whispered, "Maybe you're right. But what else is there for us to do?" Henke didn't answer. He didn't have to. 2 days later, U-515 departed Lorient under gray skies. The bass band played a half-hearted tune on the pier. A few officers saluted. Most didn't bother. Henke stood on the conning tower as the boat eased into open water. He watched the coastline recede, the bombed-out harbor, the cranes frozen in ruin, the flocks of gulls circling above the wreckage. "Set course west," he ordered. The crew moved silently, performing their tasks with mechanical precision. They'd all done this too many times. Every man aboard knew what the odds were now. For the first 2 days, the patrol was uneventful. The sea was calm, the skies low and overcast. They maintained radio silence. No contact, no sign of life. Then, on the 3rd day, the radar warning receiver began to shriek. "Aircraft approaching! Crash dive!" The klaxon blared. Men scrambled to their stations. The hull plunged beneath the waves, the ballast tanks hissing as they filled. Moments later, explosions rolled through the deep. Sharp, fast, coordinated. The Allied pilots no longer dropped random patterns. Their attacks were mathematical, precise. Depth charges bracketed them perfectly. The boat lurched sideways, lights flickering. "Forward compartment flooding!" a voice shouted. "Pump it out!" Another explosion, closer this time. The pressure hull groaned. A wrench flew across the control room. A gauge shattered. Henke steadied himself. "Hold her level. We'll ride it out." But deep down, he knew. This wasn't war anymore. It was extermination. When they finally surfaced that night, the crew looked like ghosts. The sea was calm again, but the silence was heavier than ever. Henke stepped out onto the bridge. The stars above were bright and cold. He looked up at them, remembering the words of an old mentor from years ago. The sea gives everything and takes everything back. He closed his eyes and let the wind hit his face. The Atlantic smelled of salt and smoke and memory. He knew then that he would not bring U-515 home again. But he also knew this. The age of the hunter was over. The world had moved on. Machines now ruled the deep. And for all its brutality, there was something almost peaceful in that realization. April 9th, 1944, North Atlantic. Dawn came like iron, the sky cold and metallic, the sea still and deceptive. U-515 drifted 50 miles southwest of Madeira, engines idling. Henke stood on the bridge, his greatcoat stiff with salt. Through the binoculars, the horizon shimmered with faint heat haze. He knew they'd been found. The radar alarms had begun hours earlier, distant pings that grew closer with every pass. Allied aircraft had their scent now, circling like vultures. Sound contact, the hydrophone operator whispered below. Destroyers, at least 3. Henke descended the ladder slowly, pausing by the chart table. The map before him was covered in pencil marks, patrol lines, bearings, escape routes. They were meaningless now. The Allies had closed every gap. He exhaled, calm, resigned. Prepare for depth charges. The men moved without panic. They knew what came next. The first explosions came minutes later, distant and rhythmic, like drums echoing through the deep. Then came the real barrage. Blinding, concussive, merciless. U-515 shuddered violently. The lights flickered, then died. Metals screamed as rivets sheared from their sockets. Henke gripped the periscope column. "Maintain trim, don't panic," the engineer shouted. "Flooding in the engine room. Fire in the aft battery compartment." Henke's voice was steady. "Seal it. Everyone forward." They were sinking. 90 meters, 100, 110. The hull groaned like a dying beast. "Sir," X said softly, "we can surface and surrender." Henke looked at him, eyes hard but not unkind. "Yes, we can." He hesitated, then nodded. Surface. The ballast tanks blew. The submarine rose. When U-515 broke the surface, daylight poured through the hatches. The destroyers were already closing in, guns trained. A British aircraft circled above, its engines a low growl. Henke emerged onto the bridge, raising his hands. The wind whipped at his face, carrying the smell of cordite and seawater. For a moment, everything was still. The ocean, the sky, the enemy, all frozen in time. Then a voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "Abandon ship! Hands up!" Henke nodded once. "Do it," he said quietly. The crew climbed out, one by one, into lifeboats. Behind them, U-515 listed heavily to starboard, smoke pouring from her vents. Henke stayed until the last man was off. Then he placed his cap on the railing and gave a final order. "Flood the boat." As he stepped into the freezing water, he looked back one last time at the gray hull disappearing beneath the waves. The sea swallowed her whole. The destroyers approached cautiously, sailors shouting, ropes thrown to the survivors. When they hauled Henke aboard, an American officer extended a hand. "You fought well, Captain." Henke met his eyes and replied softly, "No, we just lasted longer than most." He looked out across the Atlantic, endless and merciless, and whispered to himself, "It's over." And somewhere beneath the surface, the last of the wolfpack drifted into silence.